Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Philippine Pavilion's Arena stage. This is the session Philippine Art in the World, featuring curator Patrick Flores and Filipino-American artist Miljohn Ruperto, sharing their personal and professional assessment of the place in the world of Philippine art. I will be introducing our esteemed panel. They will be speaking, and then we will have time for questions. Patrick D. Flores is a pioneering voice in Southeast Asian contemporary art. His work bridges academic research and curatorial practice, reshaping narratives around coloniality, regional identity, and cultural discourse. From festival scale platforms like Venice and Singapore Biennale to foundational museums, museum roles, and the training of new scholars, his influence spans local and global art ecosystems. A leading Filipino art historian and curator, Patrick Flores is professor and Vargas Museum curator at UP, artistic director of Singapore Biennale 2019, and curator at Venice Biennale Philippines 2015, Taiwan 2022. His publications and fellowships speak to his deep engagement with Southeast Asian modern and contemporary art. Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Flores. Miljohn Ruperto is a cross-disciplinary artist working across photography, cinema, performance, and digital animation. His work refers to historical and anecdotal occurrences and speculates on the nature of assumed facts and the construction of truth. Ladies and gentlemen, Miljohn Ruperto. So you may now present.
Okay. So we're going to sort of divide this talk between Patrick and myself, and I'm sort of just going to introduce two diasporic artists or Filipino-American artists that recently had two major shows in the States. The first one is Paul Pfeiffer and his prologue to the story of the birth of freedom at MoCA Los Angeles in 2023, and also Josh Klein, whose project for a New American Century was at the Whitney Museum, also in 2023. So I guess I want to sort of gather or group these two people or these two artists and talk about a kind of maybe a kind of shared sensibility and focus in their practices and how that relates to this idea of what is diasporic, what is a diasporic practice, and what I sort of see in their practices that are interesting or relevant vis-a-vis globalization and so on. So I wanted to start with sort of talking about how both of their practice focus on how their own practices are implicated in this idea of globalization, and this self-awareness shapes the politics of their artistic production. Or I would even say in a more stronger way that their artistic production is based, they basically focus, their artistic production centers around globalization, and the shape of these practices inform the subject of their works. With Paul Pfeiffer, his commitment to working with artisans and craftspeople in the Philippines to produce his artworks sort of foregrounds this sort of this desire to kind of use this relationship to the Philippines as he foregrounds these negotiations with the artisans in the Philippines, and that in turn shapes sort of his relationship to the Philippines. And Josh Klein also, in his practice, takes on the model of filmmaking as a kind of as a kind of template for crediting labor in his projects. And so both artists are hyper aware of how sort of material and social conditions bring about their own practices, right? And how they define their own responsibilities to internationally and locally, right? So both their projects center on the negotiations between international and local practices. And it also drives the logic that shapes their responsibilities that's inherent in these types of collaboration in a globalized art world or art market. But one of the arguments, I guess, would be that this sensibility of being able to navigate these sort of global economic conditions sort of presents a kind of diasporic that's ideal as the ideal subject in globalization. We can turn this and say that globalization demands a diasporic subjectivity. And we could see sort of this in the recent social political upheaval in the United States, where many Americans have run towards ultranationalism as a kind of existential reaction to being decentered. Yeah. And so I think this mindfulness of looking at how you interface with the global art world and how it shapes your own production, I think is interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Miljohn. Thank you, Miljohn, for that presentation. This panel doesn't aim to comprehensively survey what's happening with Filipino artists on the global stage. It's supposed to raise some questions about how we think about the Philippine presence on the global stage, or the stage which we regard as like outside of the Philippines. No? So the key term here is the world, right? In the world, and we are interested in worldliness. And worldliness doesn't have to be equated with globalization. And I think this is what Miljohn is trying to also point out, that the idea of being in the world is not the same as being like globalized. Although there's a relationship between being worldly, being present in the world, and being part of the global network. So this is where the complication sets in, and he tries to foreground the practices of Josh Klein and Paul Pfeiffer, who are circulating quite well on the global stage, and at the same time would bear the marks of being Filipino. So we divided this panel into two sets of artists who are like diasporic artists, and artists who have remained in the Philippines and also circulate globally. No? So I think that would complicate our assumptions about the Philippines in the world, right? And also of worldliness as a concept. So my work as a curator, I look at of course, national art history, so artists within the nation, but also how artists within the nation move away from the nation to become part of a larger context. So this larger context could be regional, which is Southeast Asia, right? Or maybe Asia, or Asia in the Pacific. So the regional is also imagined differently. But when we say regional, it's almost like I mean, automatically we think of the region, which is Southeast Asia. But Southeast Asia is also a colonial construction. So that you have to bear that in mind, that there is a larger Southeast Asia beyond what the Cold War has taught us. No? That Southeast Asia could be, could extend to the Indian Ocean, it could be part of Australasia, and so on and so forth. So again, the idea of the region is also complicated. And then there is this category of the international. Is that different from the regional? So the international would implicate maybe the West. No? That is different from the regional. Although in the national, we already see the West, especially if in the context of the Philippines, which was successively colonized 3 times, right? So the national is actually highly mediated by the international in many ways. And then finally, what is the global? No? So there's you have the national, the regional, the international, and the global. So these are ways of making sense of the world, right? Of the world. And that's in my work as a curator, I deal with these like circuits or nodes of or channels within which artists move around. So for me, the key term of Miljohn is diasporic. And I think it's important to foreground this diasporic agency. But my key term is the local. For me, the local is worldly. Yeah, my key term is local, that is extensive. So I call it an extensive locality. Yeah, so because there is that binarism between the global and the global, right? It is as if the local is just in the periphery, marginal, and the global is way out there, right? But for me, the global is extensive. So I'm trying to recover the global from that assumption that it is, minor or peripheral or provincial even. So I call it an extensive locality, or maybe better, an extensive interlocality. So it's an interlocal. So instead of international, I prefer interlocal, because the national is a form of the local, I think. So it's an interlocality, an extensive interlocality that engages with other constellations of localities that are named national or international or global. The modernity of such locality may be described by new folkloristics. This is my view, that the locality may be described by a new folkloristics and emergent migrant aesthetics. So foregrounding both belongingness and also travel or movement. So that's what I'm thinking of today. Just to complicate this notion of the local and the global, I think we have to move away from this local-global binarism to really recover the promise of the worldly, right? The worldly. So this is, yeah. So I chose artists who have remained in the country but have circulated quite intensively overseas. And I chose Kidlat Tahimik and Isa Hoxon. So their faces just move in a loop behind us. So Kidlat Tahimik is a filmmaker, I think you know, all of you know, and a self-taught one, no formal training. But Kidlat Tahimik also has become an installation and performance artist, also on his own accord. Also no formal training, was not part of a fine arts tradition, fine arts school tradition. And also, early part of his career, he was in the film context, not really in the contemporary art context, but now he is. So it's also an interesting development in his practice, from film to to installation, but through his own instincts, which are local. No? Perfume Nightmare, for instance, his first film, talks about the locality of a town in Laguna, and then also focuses on the hybridity and refunctioning of the jeepney. Jeepney is the wheelless jeep of the Americans that was transformed into a decorated transport by Filipinos after the war. So it is also, in a way, an example, an instance of this like interlocal transformation. And then also the fantasy of a trip to the moon via a fascination with the rocket engineer Werner von Braun. It's also in the film, the German. So the German cuts into the local town. So So what is this film? Right? Is it local? Is this German? Is this international? What is this? So I like this confusion. And I think we should start at the confusion, not at the origin or the destination, but at the confusion because it is generative. So there was also strong, let us say, international reception to Kidlat by Werner Herzog, by Frederick Jameson, the theorist, and the writer Susan Sontag. No? And it was shown at the Berlinale, the first shown internationally at the Berlinale, and was distributed by Francis Ford Coppola. Francis Ford Coppola. So this is an interesting situation, like how like Kidlat Tahimik from Baguio becomes part of the global film circuit. So that's one example. So Kidlat Tahimik has been made to represent the third world, also the third cinema, different kind of cinema that maybe refunctions certain techniques to make it into something else. But within the national, Kidlat also emphasizes his being part of the North. So even then, so the national is within the national you have localities still, no? So part of the North, part of the Cordillera, and would invoke I mean, if you've seen him, the the culture of the Ifugao. So that's also another complication. But he also doesn't want to represent national identity, because within the national there is a strong assertion of the local, no? And then the local gets picked up internationally, and somehow that locality becomes national again in the international scene, right? So this is a complicated affair. That's why it bears, unpacking. Yeah. And then my second example is Isa Hoxson, a woman, who was trained as a visual artist at the Philippine High School for the Arts, and then has become a dance artist. I wouldn't say dancer, maybe choreographer also, but maybe a movement artist, no? Who engages in installation and also performance. Maybe, but also I cannot say performance artist. So I like these artists because they cannot be pigeonholed. They cannot be pinned down pinned down to categories that we already know. So I'm interested in artists to try to release themselves from the grammar of art world nominations, like you're called this, you're called that, right? So I think this is the promise of art is in this kind of kinetic movement of the practice, no? And so Isa Hoxson explores Philippine affective labor, meaning the entertainer, for instance, in nationally and internationally. Also the masculine, the queer, also the woman. So the body mutates and circulates internally and externally, which is what interests me. From woman to macho dancer, for instance. From maid to witch. Yeah, which is the Philippine subjects as princess of Disney, or singer in a band, or entertainer in Japan. So I like this, but very locally produced. But the circulation is intensively international, global, national. Well, we're caught up in these words, but we try to refuse them too. But because we have to speak, we have to articulate something here. So all these terms are under erasure, so to speak. No? So they're like within quotes and so on. So I'm also interested in the interlocal as an interdiscipline, right? Because I mentioned already the interlocal, and to complicate the interlocal, I'd like to introduce the notion of the interdiscipline, like what Kidlat and Isa are doing. They're interdisciplinary artists, no? So they expand the repertoire of artistic practice, no? And I think they can do this because they were not really burdened by maybe art world expectations from the start, right? They, like, if you come from performance and then you move into contemporary art, a different trajectory. And if you come from film and then you move into installation without any background in both film and fine arts, that's also an interesting trajectory. So I'm interested in this, the interlocal, as the interdiscipline that cannot be easily caught by any category of practice. So I end my, my first remarks on those.
I guess, part of the conversation we've been having before sort of revolves, it's funny to think about how you describe Kidlat Tahimik's practice, but it sort of echoes your own practice as a curator, as kind of building up like a modernity, an art modernity in the Philippines, and it's always kind of a dicey affair, and so maybe you could talk about how you navigate the pitfalls of your job as an art historian in creating this art modernity in the Philippines, in terms of the pitfalls of commodification or kind of being lost again in the conversation of nationalism.
Yeah, that's a vast question, Miljohn. But what I try to do is to complexify the local subjectivity, no? That so that it becomes less prone to reduction or to easy appropriation that might lead to exotification or just representation of like a national identity. So the challenge is how to complexify the local artistic subject. No? So as a curator, I engage in a lot of mixing. Also as a in my art history also would try to be more curatorial in its perspective. So by doing so, the certain expectations of the art world are maybe disarticulated, or they are confused, or they are like subjected to revision. No? So I think this level of mixture helps me complexify the local artistic subject. So whether in the writing of the art history, that you constellate the work in relation to other works that may not be easily identifiable as belonging to the same category. Yeah, and also in the exhibition, you bring together forms that do not easily conform to expected classification. So this is my strategy as art historian and a curator. No, to for me, it's important to develop an immune system, a different immune system for the artist, so that the artist is not easily reduced or simplified or made to represent. No? So of course it becomes also very difficult because it's the recognition is not quick, and they're not very legible, and maybe they don't survive translation elsewhere. No, they cannot be just easily translated. Oh, this is Filipino artist, and that's why the art should look like this. No? So I try to do that, and you can only do this by making by thickening. I think thickening the context of the subjectivity, because when it goes out there, the subjectivity tends to thin out. No? Because it thins out because it's translated quickly, And then there's also a desire for representation, that you have to, this artist comes from the Philippines, so the artist should represent the Filipino identity. No, so it thins out. But actually in the locality, it's thick. It's thick. But when it goes outside, it thins out because it has to be translated. So this is the challenge for the curator and the art historian on how to complexify this, the subjectivity of the extensively local artist. Yeah, yeah. So maybe my question also for you, Miljohn, has something to do with the status of the diasporic artist, right? Like, for instance, how do you feel being called like you're a diasporic artist? Because on the one hand, being a diasporic artist would reference a trace of the ethnic, no? Because you come from somewhere and then, but you are resettled elsewhere. But by being a diasporic artist, you are in some kind of contact zone, right? So there's this ethnicity that you have to, I don't know, speak to, but at the same time cannot be reduced to because you're something else, right? Somebody else. And then there is also the desire for you to, there's also the desire for patriation, right? Patriation, meaning to speak to like a patria, meaning country. So it's either like you're an expatriate, but you also want to repatriate, no? Your like identity previously, or maybe as part of the heritage. So how do you feel about that category of the diasporic artist as you're working in the United States, and specifically in like Los Angeles?
I, the way I would sort of address that question would be more about, I guess, my recent thoughts on time and temporality, and how, and this question of identity also seems very, is sort of stuck in a kind of spatial imagining, and never considered a kind of located, but being mindful of being in time and being able to process or do these sort of operational things in time, like opting into an identity, or navigating or reflecting. And these kinds of dynamic operations would be much more, I guess, addressable, or I would be more comfortable in speaking that way, or even thinking about my own identity in that way of opting into, and whatever sort of Filipino-ness is ascribed to me or my practice. I think, the way I address that would be, I opt into those expectations also, and that's okay. And I could redefine it in real time or wherever I'm at. So I think there's always the possibility of negotiation for, with those aspects of or expectations of identity. Yeah.
But I was wondering, Miljohn, how like the American art world would receive the identity effect, because I call it identity effect, right? Not really identity as a fully formed thing, but some kind of effect. No? So I was wondering how the American art world would respond to the identity effect of in Josh Klein and also in Paul Pfeiffer, that that this recognition that they are Filipino. So what does it do to their valuation as artists? Is this like identity effect? Does it enhance like their value as artists in, let us say, a multicultural America, or in a globalizing art world? So, or does it like diminish also does it diminish their value because like, oh, it's like, maybe in the context of, let us say, affirmative action or DEI so what is the how because you talk of negotiation, right? So how is this identity effect negotiated in the case of Josh Klein, who just had this big show at the Whitney, right? And then of course Paul Pfeiffer, who recently had a show at LA MoCA, very strong, important institutions uh, of contemporary art in America.
I think, you know, I think both artists and, I personally know them, so I've talked to them. I think they make work or they're mindful of making work in different registers. And I think this is how they address the issue, where they're happy to be talked about, or their work talked about within a kind of, like even in a diasporic or a national conversation, right? So they could both, within their respective practices, they could both speak as Americans or have a kind of American practice, but also be welcome or welcome a conversation about their particular diasporic subjectivity, or Filipino-ness or diasporic in general. I think their practice addresses all those issues all at the same time, and I think this is how they're able to navigate through these issues that you're saying. And again, like built into their practices is a kind of mindfulness also of how they relate to the Philippines or Filipino-ness or these issues. So it's already built into their practices also. So they address it, right away, and they don't shy away from it. Yeah.
Yeah. It would also be interesting to see how Philippine art world in the Philippines would look at them. So that one is another story, right? Like how the Philippine art world looks at Filipino, I mean, diasporic artists with Philippine heritage. Like, are they, like how would they negotiate their presence in the Philippines, right? So, like in your case, do you have that desire to be also present in the Philippines, while because your practice is in the diaspora, right? So is it important for you, or maybe by extension, important for Paul or Josh to be also present in the Philippines at a certain in a certain way? Yeah, I mean, not physically present all the time, but because like Isa Hoxon and Kidlat Tahimik are present elsewhere, no? They are present in Europe, America. I mean, they circulate quite well, but they're in the Philippines. So if we think of the reverse, yeah, if is it part of the diasporic artist's desire to be present in the locality, from which the diasporic identity also derives, no? Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the main features of a kind of diasporic, just being in the diaspora would be a kind of longing for connection also. And I think this is one of the compelling features of being diasporic. There's always this issue. And I think, yeah, I'm sure they would love to show in the Philippines, as I would also. Yeah. Yeah. So I I guess I wanted to circle back to this question of modernity in the Philippines and modernity kind of, or the question of modernity as a kind of interface or requirement into a kind of globalized art world, where the Philippines had to have its own modernity, and Korea and so on, and so how does this practice of being more curatorial, let's say in the question of the Sobel show, which is showing right now at the National Gallery in Singapore, how do you think about your responsibilities in terms of cultivating or protecting a kind of I don't know, a particular the local history or a particularity vis-a-vis like expanding it out and circulating in the world?
Yeah, maybe quick one because we have to go to the Q&A. Uh, I think Sobel is not. It's an easy way to. I mean, it's an easy example because inherently Sobel was already a transcontinental artist, being is a Philippine-born Spanish artist, right? And the family has extensive connection to the Philippines economically. And the family was part of the history of colonialism and, of course, capitalism in the Philippines. So that's part of the account of Sobel. So he worked in 3 different sites in the United States, in the Philippines, and then in Spain. So at the outset, or intrinsically, he was already translocal, no, or interlocal because there was an interaction. So yeah, so the exhibition in Singapore tried to frame Sobel as a global modernist, that just to overcome this desire to call him like, or to confine him to like a national moment, right? Well, is he a Spanish artist? Is he a Filipino artist, right? Is he a Filipino-Spanish artist? And then you say, no, he's a global modernist. Yeah. So that is one way to surmount the binary. But the global modernist has its own problems, and maybe it will take another symposium to unpack that. But I think the global modernist releases Sobel from certain national or nationalist expectations, and we also in the exhibition curatorially we presented the modern art of the 3 places. So there was the modern art of the United States with abstract expressionism. So Sobel's works were seen alongside Rothko and Klein. And in the Philippine section, in the Philippine period, the works of Sobel were seen in relation to his colleagues, his peers in the modern movement in the Philippines, with Nena Sagil and H.R. Ocampo, Lee Aguinaldo, Jose Hoya, and so on and so forth. And in the Spanish section, his works were seen alongside the Spanish informalists, like Tapies or Canugar or Rueda, and so on and so forth. So you had 3 modernities around the global modernism of Sobel. So I think that is one way to complexify Sobel. So this is not like Sobel. So if we see Sobel in the world, then we have to see the modernities of that world. And there were 3, right? Philippine, New England, and Spanish. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Does anyone in the audience have a question for our panelists?
Hello, can you hear me?
Right.
Hello, there you are. I'm Jody De La Cruz and I'm here with my wife, Miriam. Our legacy dream is to one day build the Museum of Modern Filipino Art. And we have purchased a 2-hectare property on Mount Samat. And we have a starting collection. And we have the design and it's incorporated. We have a website. Now my question is, as artists and curators, is this something you would think would catch the imagination or attention, let's say, of Filipinos abroad or even in the local milieu? Or you just tell us, oh, that's just a pipe dream. You can just forget about it. In fact, even the title, we have already incorporated the Museum of Modern Filipino Art. I already got some feedback. Oh, modernism started and ended here. And I said, no, it started then, but the art continues to evolve with every new generation. But that's a plug. I just want to go back to my original question. Is this something you would encourage us to do for the sake of our artists, both in the Philippines and abroad?
Yeah, that's a very noble aspiration. And I commend you for that, for not just collecting, right? Because collecting is one thing, but to create an infrastructure to display and present it to the public is another thing. Fernando Sobel did that. And Fernando Sobel is actually maybe the only one in the world who was able to establish 2 museums of modern art, one in Manila, the Ateneo, and one in Cuenca at the Casas Colgadas, the Museum of Spanish Abstraction. So like 2 modernities, 2 collections, 1 founder, right? Fernando Sobel. Yeah, it's always important to have this collection of modern art. In the Philippines, the institutions are not so strong in that regard. That's why maybe you saw the vacuum, right, or a void to fill. It's a important initiative, but of course the issue is how it's curated. Yeah, and also but what's the nature of the collection, and also what is its how does it imagine its public? Like if it's in Mount Samat, right? Yeah. So is there like, what is the public sphere, right, in Mount Samat? Or is this meant to be like a destination that we all go to Mount Samat to go to see the art and so on and so forth? So it depends on the vision of the institution. But yeah, any effort to collect modern art and to create a curatorial condition and also a contact zone for art and public to meet is always welcome. And I commend you for. I'm sure you will say it's thankless, right? But but yeah, we do certain things now for yeah.
I basically agree with Patrick. I think also it requires a kind of focused conversation if you want to engage with artists internationally, and just engaging in that conversation of what we're talking about earlier, of diaspora or locality and globalization. All these issues, I think, rise up when we're talking about contemporary art now. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? If there are no other questions, maybe a final word from each of our panelists based on what we've discussed today.
Okay, I'll have the second to the last word. I think mostly, it's kind of great to have this sort of I have a kind of ongoing, evolving conversation with Patrick, and I think it's good to be able to engage in these sort of questions of locality also. And now that you're also, in a way, a diasporic subject. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important for curators and artists to keep the conversation going. I enjoy my conversations with Miljohn because he is a thinking artist. He also writes quite well. So I think it's important for this, you know, engagement to be sustained. Yeah. As a curator and art historian, I also allow artists to to provide theoretical prompts. No? It's not like it's the curator or art historian who always tries to explain, right? Or tries to explain away. I allow artists also to form the theoretical context of my practice. I learn a lot from just the process of like how they do things and how they think. Like for instance, this pavilion, the theoretical context came from Rizal. No? So it's not like I'm imposing my own theory on the pavilion, but the theory arises from the thinking of writer for this book fair, who is like Jose Rizal. No? So yeah, I think that engagement should be sustained. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Flores and Miljohn Ruperto.